Hello. Hi. I'm Emily, and before we begin the session, just a few house notes. Not surprisingly, you've got to silence your cell phone, but you're actively encouraged to tweet. The hashtag is SkollWF, which I'm sure you know by this stage. We'll be having a lot of interaction from you throughout the session, but because this session's being filmed, in case you haven't already realized that you're on camera, please wait for the microphones before you speak, and there are these brilliant people who will be coming around with those mics. And if you have a Skoll World Forum app, I'd be grateful if you check into this session. So you just open the app, find it, click on the arrow on the right and press check in, almost like getting on a plane. Now, I'll ask you in a minute a bit about what you want from this session so I can make sure that we deliver value for you. But before doing that, I thought in order for you to make up your mind what you want, I should introduce our absolutely fantastic panel. We've got here on my right Miguel LUENGO-OROZ, who's really at the cutting edge of using big data for social good. And you, Miguel, you call yourself an anti-disciplinary scientist, which I rather like. And you've got a host of scientific degrees to your name. And you're also the founder of Malaria Spot, which is this really fantastic crowdsourcing game where you can get to hunt out malaria parasites in a little blood sample. I've played it myself, not brilliant at it, but it's a good game and obviously has a potential to do a lot of good. But you're also, very relevant to this session here, you're Chief of Research at UN's Global Pulse, where you do a host of fantastic innovations using big data for development and really fabulous inventive partners and projects, and we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that, I'm sure, as the session progresses. We have Ken CUKIER as well. Now, Ken, you're data editor of The Economist and also author of Big Data, A Revolution, which will transform how we live, how we work, and how we think. So just small stuff, really. And you argue, in fact, that this revolution is on the same scale as the internet and perhaps even of the printing press. And you've also been a foreign correspondent in Japan for many years, covering business and finance, and before that, technology. But also, very relevant for the crowd here, you're on the board of a Skoll awardee, International Bridges to Justice. Jim FRUCHTERMAN. Now, your Twitter profile, Jim, says that you're a rocket engineer, turned tech entrepreneur, turned social entrepreneur. And pretty successful. You've won a Skoll Award many years ago. How many of these have you been to?
10.
10. It's not quite 11. You didn't get to stand up yesterday, but pretty impressive. And your company, Benetech, figures out all sorts of ways to use technology to solve a host of different challenges, from literacy to documenting human rights abuses to working out and figuring out how we can use the environment better. And your website says that your team is busy inventing the future of technology. So you're going to hear it here. Now, Larry Brilliant needs a little introduction for this crowd over here. Runs the Skoll Global Threats Fund, a physician, the first director of Google, rather than Google Philanthropy, and a key role at the WHO to successfully eradicate smallpox. But also, you might not know, a real technology pioneer, because way back in 1985, he co-founded the Well online community. And he's also guaranteed to inject a little bit of humor and mischief into today's session. And in case, I just thought I should give you, if you're wondering quite who he is, it's a rather nice photo of him here in today's Wired, looking maybe a little bit frightening, and I'm sure we won't see that him here. So now you know who the panel is, and you can tell that this is a very representative, sample. If we data analyze this panel, all men. So it is going to be pretty important. I'm really pleased that we've got a lot of women in the audience, so we're really going to want to hear from you when we reach out. But just so that it can help us frame our whole discussion, I thought it might be really helpful to know from you guys whether you are already using data in a big way or big data in your organizations at the moment. Could you put your hands up? Okay, I think that's about a third of you. And how many of you see yourselves, or motivation for coming here, that you see yourselves needing to use this more data in the whole way that you do your work? In different ways. Okay, so that's pretty much, and how many of you feel that you're pretty far down the line of figuring out how to use data and big data? Okay, that's pretty conclusive. I'm going to ask you next for a quick question. Are you more interested in us focusing today on maximizing the downsides, on looking for the opportunities and challenges of data and big data, or both? So starting at the beginning, do you want to look on how, sorry, did I say maximize downside? Woo! Minimize the downside. So let's just hear from you. Are you more interested in minimizing the downsides of using big data? Hands up. Okay. Maximizing the opportunities? Okay, a much bigger majority, or both? Okay, so we want to be slightly more focused on maximizing the opportunities. I hope you all got to put your hands up, because of course big data is not just a sample, it's about using all the data in the room. So I trust you do there. But I think maybe let's kick off a bit with looking at some of the challenges to data at the beginning. And I wanted just to start because of course it's such an absolutely live topic. It's no longer hypothetical. Organizations, commercial organizations, development organizations are all figuring, as you have indicated with your interest, on how to use the new tools that are available, these digital breadcrumbs that we're all leaving behind, and this intense computing power to make sense of those breadcrumbs. And the rules on how to share, how to protect, how to use this data are not yet written. So we're at this really interesting stage of the whole game. And there's not a consensus, and we'll see whether we get to a consensus by the end. But Jim, I'm interested in, you have quite a lot of concerns around privacy, and this has come particularly from some of your experience in Uganda.
Yes, I think we collect sensitive data all over the world, we being the social sector, and what we know now, thanks to Snowden, is that like almost any government is vacuum cleaning up every scrap of data that you send through the network. So if you're collecting data about someone's LGBT status, HIV status, domestic violence experience, rape experience, their ethnic affiliation, their tribal affiliation, the list of data goes on, each of those things that makes them vulnerable or gives them identity makes them at risk for being victimized in the future, if not by the current government, by a future government. And so my kind of analogy is I want my medical data in the US protected, and it is under US laws. As we go out there, we should treat other people's data the way we want their data treated. And this is not a hypothetical issue. I mean, we've been working with the LGBT movement in Africa for 2.5 years in places like Uganda. And of course, we write software for documenting human rights abuses. But the second most common use of our software, which has got strong crypto, is to back up the membership databases of the LGBT groups, because they're experiencing police raids where the police will come and try and get the membership list, and in a couple cases they got partial lists, and then they went out and outed everyone on that list to their family, to their employer, to their landlord. And so your identity, this sensitive information, is really important. So I know we can't put the genie in the bottle completely, but when you handle this critical information, treat it with the respect, because we have a duty first to do no harm.
And Miguel, what's your experiences? How does the UN Pulse team work with these issues?
I mean, as we're saying, I think that the main point here is which is the right level of protection that we need for the data. So we are protecting the privacy of people, but on the other hand, we are still making use of the data. Okay, and I think that I mean, we are working trying to find which is that level where big data or data it can be a public good. I mean, one context is this one of this member list in Uganda, which is clear. But let's put another example. Let's say that we have an earthquake and populations have to migrate north, south, east, west. We need to know where people are going so we can develop the, I mean, put the hospital, put the campaigns, I mean, whatever we need. For that, probably information from mobile phones moving would be the best way to know where people are going. Okay, so here the trade-off between, let's say, risk in privacy and what you can do if you understand where people are moving. It's, I mean, we need to know where people are going. Okay, so really it depends on the case and depends on the level of aggregation. I mean, also it's we are all confident with statistics when we say, hey, in London we have X million of people. You can even go down. In this place, there are 10,000 people, but we are not confident saying, hey, in your home lives 3 people. Okay, so which is the right level? I mean, it works also for statistics. We have to find the right scale.
And Ken, in your work, where are you feeling on the level of aggregation which people are feeling confident about? Is that changing?
It's changing a little bit, and I think it needs to change even more because, of course, it's not really just about the access of the data, it's about the usage of the data.
Can everybody hear Ken? I'm just wondering if, no, they haven't.
Yeah.
I think your mic's not quite...
Let me actually see that it's, oh, that works. Okay, let me just move it up. There we go. Thanks. I'll look straight, and I won't look at you anyway. I'll look at others. I think it's changing, and I think it depends on what the usage of the data is, not just that the data has been collected and has the potential to be used. So you can imagine that in certain cases, it's only appropriate to have the aggregate data of where people are going, for example, after a calamity. That might be the case. But in other instances, it's actually quite essential that you have it down to the individual. I'll give you an example. Imagine during the calamity, an NGO that has information on disabled people and blind people would want to know where they've gone to. They've been spread around to lots of different shelters, spending overnight in evacuation centers, but they have special needs that the evacuation centers aren't set up to provide. So it's very it would be wonderful and easy for the official bodies to then go to the NGO, the most relevant body who is probably registered with officialdom in some way, to be able to find out, okay, here's the cell phone numbers. Let's find out where the pings are coming from. Let's find out where they are. Let's get people there to give the blind people what they need and other people with other needs and others. Now, this is actually a real example that's very close to me because I was in Japan covering the aftermath. Well, I was there during the crisis of the earthquake and tsunami and the meltdown of Fukushima. A lot of evacuees during that period, not just in the disaster zone up north, as well as because of nuclear radiation. And I spoke to someone who was an NGO. I was driving around with him a few days afterwards as we were going from site to site, evacuation center to center. And he said that actually one of the impediments was that the NGOs who were responsible for blind people, in this case, couldn't find out where the people were. And from the ministry who was collecting this information at the evacuation centers, this person blind. And the reason why is they felt that it was compromising their privacy. So in this case, I mean, it's nonsensical, but in Japan, even the best of times, there's rules that unless there's some sort of consensus process, and it's usually a long period one, to actually change the rule, there's no one who feels empowered to actually break a rule and show it. There was a rule that you don't share this information, so they couldn't share it. And of course, this is completely against the interests of the individuals, but that was the case. So it suggests, I think, that we need a new maturity in how we use data. We can't have these blanket rules of whether we could only keep it aggregated and never disaggregate it to the individual. It depends on the case.
But do you think whose responsibility it is to make those decisions?
Well, it's never going to be, we're not in a world anymore where it's any one person's decision. There's no single authority. Everything is going to be done through a multi-stakeholder approach and through feeling our way. So in this instance, you could imagine just that sensible people at the mobile phone operator, at the NGO, and probably with a touch of government somehow as well, would make the decision on a case-by-case basis. Particularly in a crisis moment, a decision in a moment of crisis, you're going to have to disregard the playbook and do what's most sensible and be accountable for it afterwards.
Larry, you've worked in all sorts of crisis situations. Where do you stand on this?
Well, first I want to make, this is not a crisis. I mean, our conversation up here is not a crisis. Yeah.
Well, despite your photo.
I guess I have three general thoughts. One is that big data has gone more quickly from an idea to a meme to a cliche than almost any idea, and I think that's because of big data and because of the internet and the speed of the transmission of information. So I find that kind of interesting and ironic. I'm no longer sure what big data means. I used to know when I was at Google and we built Google FluTrends, Mark Smolinski and 3 engineers and I, and we did what we were told at the time was the biggest data set that had ever happened. We got every keystroke that had ever entered into Google in Google's history, and we did hundreds of thousands of multiple logistic regressions. I understood then that that was big data, and Google had something called Big Table that stored all of its big data in it. But it's not just governments that are trying to find out everything about everybody. It's corporations, it's armies for cyber terrorism, it's any one of us that has the individual means, it's NGOs in many cases, and maybe NGOs that we don't like, that are not, friendly NGOs. So, one, I think it's a cliche, no longer as clear what it really means. Two, we have to be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. When we think of Snowden and the NSA revelations, we have an emotional reaction to the bad stuff that is done with spying in our name and having data available. But you'd never have Global Pulse. You'd never be able to monitor the Millennium Development Goals and our progress towards them. We'd never be able to try to say anything as audacious as let's stop pandemics in our lifetime if we didn't have big data to find out where pandemics were. So I'm concerned about that. And then lastly, conflation. Are we really talking about data? Are we really talking about rights? Are we talking about cyber warfare because we no longer talk about nuclear warfare or bio? Is that where we're worried? Are we worried about corporate spying, or are we worried about corporate withholding and holding and hoarding of all of our information? So there's so much here, and sort of where you stand is where you sit. So I'd be interested more hearing where everybody else sits to know really what it is. But it's a complicated issue in Pandora's box that we've opened.
I mean, one of the things that you said that you're interested in really looking at some of the potential for data and big data in some of the work that you're doing. And I just thought it might be useful in that vein, just to kick off, Miguel, in hearing something that you've said in a couple of interviews I thought was really interesting about how data and big data can really enable us to become much more agile, so that in real time, when we're rolling out development programs, we can get feedback and understanding how effective they are. Maybe you could just talk us through one of the examples of the area.
Okay, so basically the idea is that we can have like faster, cheaper, better data that in our context, which is the humanitarian development context in the UN, it can serve to produce early warning, to give real-time feedback to our programs and policies, which typically is not really done in real time, or to evaluate what we have done better, okay? And here are the examples of big data, and here's like transposing things from, let's say, marketing. So, a brand can monitor Twitter to understand perceptions on Coca-Cola. On the same way, we are monitoring Twitter to understand perception populations around vaccines, around stigma and HIV. We are using that, monitoring social networks to understand what populations, what people are saying around the world about what they want to be the next Millennium Development Goals, which are going to be the Sustainable Development Goals that we are going to define over the next year. So, these are really simple examples of where are some of the opportunities to do, let's say, good. Also around mobile phone information, but always aggregated. We have seen example of mobility for natural disasters. This is clear. But also, if you combine all these types of data sources, you might be able to provide, for instance, approximations of census information. Census we do each 10 years in the countries, but we need to know where are populations so we can make policies. Okay? This is another example. So basically, in the range from early warning to evaluation, we are trying to apply all these concepts to development.
So what does it really mean if you're in a situation, I know you've worked in Indonesia looking at food prices, what data did this enable, what insights did this sort of information enable you to have that without it you wouldn't?
For instance, in this case of food prices, you have several things. One, you may have alternative ways to have to know which is the price of the food, okay? Which is interesting in case you need to make any policy measurement, okay? So it can be, let's say you have a soybean crisis in the US that impacts the Indonesian economy. The Indonesian government says we are going to cut subsidies, and then people start to say, hey, what's going on? You can see that in real time, okay? So this is interesting for policy making, let's say. So it's really understanding the perceptions of people, okay, which is something which is very expensive, because if not, you need to make household surveys, and this costs. Okay, so it's basically having like more proxy indicators.
Yeah, but here's the problem. We're going to do the Millennium Development Goals by surveying the people who have smartphones and do Twitter. Oops, the people who are most affected by development don't have the phones. The women who might, their husbands in this culture don't let them use the phone. So let's be clear that when we collect this data, we know about the people who use that technology, or we don't know about everybody. And that's why household surveys actually are important, because they're a little bit more likely to reach everybody rather than just the people who are wealthy enough to
we are
have
saying that this is a complementary source of information. It's not we're going to take out the household surveys, but it's something else.
It's also useful there's a way to square the circle, which is the household survey is very good if someone's willing to go into that area where there's the household, but in a lot of places, I know in the case of Brazil, the government agents who could otherwise do a census there or do the survey don't go there. It's kind of off the beaten path. It's an alleyway. It's polluted. It's dangerous. It's dirty, and they just turn and look the other way. And then an NGO comes along, right, and notices that in fact they have a map in which they're doing their own sort of data acquisition for something or helping people out, and they see a huge swath of 1,000 families not on the census, the government's map. Right? Very typical, right? A lot of those people there have cell phones, right? They could be reached or at least counted. Right? So there is a way to actually use the data in a more astute way than that. I mean, what's happening here is blunt, and your criticism is very legitimate, and obviously not one that Miguel hasn't thought of himself, right? But still, it's worthwhile raising. But there are ways to use this data in imaginative ways to help us just count the population.
Yeah, I mean, or even like making the surveys with mobile phone. I was speaking last week with the World Food Program, and people that work in emergencies and say, hey, there are regions of conflict, close to South Sudan, that we cannot reach. We need to make a food security assessment, and the only way we can do it is by mobile phone, because there they have mobile signal. So, really, we really need to understand the methodology and which are the bias, but still, this is the open opportunity.
I don't think you guys are disagreeing. I think there's a moment in time in the trajectory of technology when surveys are better than any kind of samples. But a stochastic sample is better than a survey. For example, in the United States, where you've got kind of more or less equitable distribution of telephones, not cell phones. The next jump in technology to cell phones or something else will make that not equitable. And that's why you have to have both. So I worry, I've become more worried about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I guess that's kind of trite, but I do worry about that, because so many of the things that we move away from have their purpose and their reason, that we need to be able to combine them with the new technologies rather than just abandon them.
Have we got some questions and comments from the floor on this whole area of sets and what we consider to be a viable set and data samples? If you do have comments or questions, please keep them brilliant and brief. I'd be very grateful. So anybody got any thoughts that they want to share in that area? No, you're absolutely silent. You've got nothing to say.
Emily, you've not admonished us to keep our answers brilliant or brief either.
A bit of energy in the room. Go on. Just wait for the mic, please.
When you do have a set that you know is biased, it's either opt-in or it's heavily skewed, and you have, you don't really have a great other source of data to match it up with. How do you adjust that, or how do you still use that, and with getting a sort of balanced view?
People ask us a lot about the bias in human rights information, right? That people are somehow making things up. The conspiracy theory attack on almost all human rights reports is the really common one. And as far as we're concerned, it doesn't happen very much. I usually take that every piece of data, on the average, is going to be actually legitimate. So it depends on what your use is, right? If you want to know, if someone texts and says, this building's collapsed and we need someone to come dig us out, I believe that's true, and you should respond to that. I think, though, if you want to say, should we only focus in the areas where we're getting cell phone signals? Well, what if a tower is out in the most damaged areas? So this is, I think, a lot of what we try to do is ground truth things. If we don't have anything, then having something is better than nothing. But usually you try to actually correlate that, and then of course, often the digital way is a cheaper way of doing it once you've actually kind of confirmed that this is a decent proxy for the bigger picture.
If you take a look at the US elections in the last cycle, and you see the uncanny, prescient ability of survey research, very small samples, usually in the order of 1,000 people, being able to predict a national election or a Senate election within fractions of a percentage point. It's because over the years that one frame, very narrow, just one frame, United States, very narrow frame, has been adjusted for response error, for bias in how many people can go to the poll or stuff like that. For most of the world and most of the data that we're looking at, we're not there yet. we're just entering new territories. Epidemiology as a science that's what we do. That's what epidemiologists do. You try to look at the burden of disease in human populations. You're constantly adjusting. Is it more than before? Is it less than before? Are we getting a new definition of a disease? Autism, for example, one of the most tragic examples in the world. If you just take the raw data, it looks like the incidence of autism looks like that. If you try to correlate the case definition of what it is to what it was before, you take that slope and you move it down like that. And if it looks like this, society's going to act like one way. If it looks like that, society's going to act another way. And it's so humanly costly to make a mistake. It's so gut-wrenching to make a decision. They're not just numbers. And that's why I say some of this stuff requires integrity and confidence and caution and being enormously careful, because you can make a big mistake and really hurt people a lot.
I was wondering whether people working in social enterprise, they have a different norms, different ethics, different obligations to the way they treat data and the way they use data to corporations. In what way? Ken, you're nodding there.
Nodding, I think it's a very good question, but I think there's an obvious answer, which is yes, there's a higher burden of care that should be taken for people who are in social enterprises and in business. But that actually underscores not the great burden and need on the social enterprise, but the laxity and paucity of rules on business. Right? They should actually be treating data with the same care as well, but they don't. They respond to different incentives.
Indeed, I wonder, I have no idea, but I wonder if there's any social enterprise that incorporates privacy risks into their metrics.
Yes, a sort of embedded.
Embedded.
Yes, I know,
like profit plus.
Do you think, I'm wondering if there's going to be more space for social enterprises in this whole arena in order to try and get a whole host of corporations to work more sensitively? No. You're nodding over here in the audience.
No, I was nodding at Miguel.
There is something I can build on that, which is a problem, and that is you would think that this is an area that is ripe for a nonprofit to get into, to actually say, hey, let's identify a problem that can be solved with data. Let's actually create a multi-stakeholder organization that can collect the data and just act as a service provider to the entities that have this real problem, that use data, and get buy-in from, say, the Gates Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, get some money from them, interact with government at all levels, from municipal to national. It existed. The company, the organization, the nonprofit, is called In Bloom. In Bloom is an organization in America. You're all nodding. The tragedy of In Bloom. They were created by educators who identified the fact that every school and school district is dealing with the problem of student data. How do you carry it across from school to school, from grade to grade? How do you do it if the person transfers? How can you actually benefit from that information to improve the quality of teaching and student outcomes? Well, In Bloom had lots of essentially interacted with states and school districts who were going to use its service, its platform, to collect the data and give the schools and districts control on how that data was used. Parents found out about it, went apoplectic, felt that this was a violation of privacy, and militated so strongly against it that state after state, until basically just last week, New York was the last state to pull out of using In Bloom's platform. This, to me, is a tragedy. This is like the first big data casualty in which public opinion, misguided public opinion, sort of pushed off the ledge one of the best things going in education and in the use of data.
I think in looking at what NGOs can do, I think many of the problems that we're describing right now are because of the way that data is collected, surreptitiously, not opt-in, against the will of, or certainly without the knowledge of the person and group from whom the data is being sniffed or gathered. But there's a whole new class of data gathering in big data, and it's opt-in, it's voluntary, it's participatory. And my colleague Mark Smolinski has created kind of a pilot called Flu Near You, where 100,000 people in the United States and many more in Australia and in Holland report every week their health status on a voluntary basis for no compensation. And they opt in and they voluntarily give that data. so that in the aggregate we can begin to see patterns. If that holds true for flu, it'll hold true for influenza or pandemics or malaria, and if that holds true in illness, perhaps it'll hold true elsewhere. But the key is totally transparent, totally open source, everything published, everything above board, all voluntary. It's not going to solve all the problems. Somebody will still get on and manipulate it and say it says one thing and not another. But maybe that's a good lesson we take from all the Snowden stuff and all the secrecy and all the government snooping, is it's all opt-in, all voluntary. Maybe we can do more with that.
But if we only looked at opt-in data, then we're going to be missing a large chunk of digital breadcrumbs, which we're going to need to use if we want to solve, challenges in a whole host of areas.
Yeah, I think, there is one important thing here, which is education, because a lot of times public data can reveal a lot of things. Last year there was an article in PNAS, in a proceedings of the National Academy American of Science, that they was saying that analyzing 100 public I like that you make in Facebook, they can guess a lot of behavioral traits, like your gender, if you are gay or lesbian, up to 80%, if you drink alcohol, if you smoke cigarettes. So really, we need to educate our, populations, what means putting something in the wall of Facebook, and what is public and what is private. And maybe it's about just public data. All the things that we can do with that. I think it's very important.
Well, and think about the different interests of the companies that are collecting the data compared to the public interest in minutes. So I had a head of a major foundation in an area say, what can big data do for my foundation? I said, what's your biggest problem? Figuring out where these 5,000 kids are that didn't graduate from high school, from our community's high schools. And I said, okay, if I can have access to Facebook, the cell phone companies, Google, I could tell you not only what 99% of those kids, where they are, I could tell you whether they went back to El Salvador, whether they're dealing drugs, whether they're playing video games all day, whether they're working, whether they went to the suburbs. Because if I have access to that data. But does Facebook want to be the company that thinks truants? No. And so, so this is a big issue. So the data is actually all there, and it's being used for viable commercial reasons. Yeah, selling you stuff.
Because
but they don't want to do it. They don't want to touch that one.
Thoughts from the floor, thoughts and questions around this space. We've got over here and then one back.
Thanks. Hi.
Do you want to just quickly say who you are as well?
Hi, I'm Danny Almagor from Australia, impact investor. But my question is, a lot of the stuff that I hear about big data, and it's big and it scares us. We're called small giants, so I'm the small part. But how do small or relatively small enterprises, a lot of the social enterprises, a lot of the businesses, that most of us are engaged with, how do we then engage with the big data? Because when you say you have access, if we could have access to Facebook and access to this, then I could find out those questions. But for me, I'd imagine even if I had access, I wouldn't know, I wouldn't have the resources to work out, how to aggregate that information and what to do with it. So how does it come back to us?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating area to explore about how NGOs navigate this space, and getting a bit of advice from our panel here. Who wants to go first?
He does. Talk to him. He does.
There's two different ways, right? We're talking about big data. Almost no social enterprise has big data, but they have data, right? And I think what most organizations should be thinking about, how can we use data to better inform the people who are running our social enterprises to do a better job for our clients, right? That's what everybody should be doing normally. I think when we talk about big data, we're talking about, Google or Facebook or Amazon, things like that. And so it's a very sort of different thing. But you can hijack some of these big data sort of things. Optimizing your website so the person that's searching for your service actually finds it, or asking Google for free ads, which we've done for years. Or connecting a social media campaign that's targeted at the community that you really want to reach. So we can borrow a lot of this apparatus, but we're probably not likely to get access to the analytics that of the data scientists, and there are people working on that as well. DataKind is trying to hack people's data, but it's not like we know everything about your behavior. We know what you opted in and told us about.
Other thoughts on this? Go on, the floor.
My name's Neil Youngblood, and I'm with Pharos Capital. Dr. Brilliant, I was curious about your comments in the newspaper. I I was curious if you could comment on the articles in the newspaper today relating to Tamiflu and the data around that.
Larry did want to talk about this beforehand, and we said no, not relevant. So go on, as it's such a topical thing, we'll allow you, and it's fast as well, a very quick
Neil,
response
I'll give you
on
the
this.
20 pounds afterwards. This morning brings the news that the British Medical Journal has published an article accusing Roche, the pharmaceutical company, of withholding the data on which you can see that Tamiflu, a drug that we depend upon in influenza pandemics, have even depended upon it for use as a quasi-vaccine in interdicting a pandemic, that it has no apparent effectiveness, and that the effectiveness has been hyped. And so the papers and Twitter are full with the amount of money that the British government, £642 million spent with Roche to buy the drug. There's accusations that it's like General Motors holding the data back about why different cars don't work, and is that a criminal action or is that a corporate malfeasance? So this is another area, and we had this conversation at the beginning of the panel, and you didn't know that, but thank you. It was, is this big data? No. Is it important? Hell yes. It's one of the reasons that when you start talking about stuff like this, it becomes so wild and out of, but this is a big thing. This idea that we depend upon some kind of an integrity of faith in the scientists, in the journals that publish it, in the review process, in the corporations who have a franchise or a license to do things, and then hold for a moment. It may be wrong. Maybe it really works. Maybe the Cochrane consensus, which gathered all that data and put it together, is wrong. So you have to take a breath and watch as it plays out and be sure you're not making the same mistake in reverse that was just made. So it's a very illustrative case. It just, I once asked Tom Friedman why he didn't write about Snowden. He said, I never write about a baseball game in the second inning. For those of you who don't know, there are 9 innings. So we're in the first inning of this, and we'll see how it plays out. But it's definitely troubling.
Go on, woman from the back, so we got to hear her voice.
Good morning, or afternoon, is it? Jo Kavanagh from Australia. I wanted to ask you a question about, say, a little more about the role of government in relation to regulation around data. In particular, I'm thinking of experiences we've had in Australia around trying to track the populations and outcomes of vulnerable children. And in our federated country, it seems to be impossible to join up data across the different states to get a national picture, let alone between the different silos of education, health, etc., when we know we have this vulnerable population of children who are growing and for whom the outcomes are not improving, but we can't actually capture a national data set to track what those children need and the well-being. So what's the role of government here in terms of legislation around vulnerable populations?
I mean, I think that first of all, the governments are starting to work in this area, and I think they should make the best for their population, so they should include these kind of data types inside their normal procedures. We need to legislate somehow or to regulate, always from the transparency point of view, but I really think the government has to work in that. I mean, I'm thinking now, 4 months ago, for the first time in the UN, was digital privacy was recognized as a human right. It was a proposal from Brazil and Germany. So basically, the space is very fragmented, because I would say, yes, I mean, Australia should do that. I mean, should find the way to understand where are vulnerable populations. On the other hand, we might have some government which is not so democratic, that may do harm, okay? So really, I mean, when speaking about a really international context, I think we should find at least the minimal requirements that should be for every country. That means, I mean, what is a human right? And I hope that this goes in the right direction. Then each country will take their path. From my point of view, always that we respect privacy of people, we should include that in the normal operations.
That's going to be tough to do. I think it's a very good question and it's a very good answer, but it's really thorny, because we would have an interest as a wise society to have a must license provision when it comes to medical data, right? We know that if we collected electronic patient records and were able to analyze all the records, that we would be able to improve the quality of care and lower the cost. And there's an expectation in democratic governments, nations, that we get great care. Great, so that's not going to go away anytime either. And of course, that inherently violates people's privacy. You could say, well, I should have a privacy right. This is my body, and this is the data around my body, and I have a property right to my body, in effect, and so I should have that to my data as well, and that would be wise as well. There's no obvious principle that you can point to that squares the circle on either one. You have to sacrifice one to get the other. So there's going to be a winner and a loser. So
Isn't there a possibility of looking at different levels of aggregation, for example, or different levels of anonymity? And
sure, but I'm responding to what Miguel is saying, that we should have as a principle, and also to Dr. Brilliant in the other sense, that we should have this ability, a principle that we should, in this new world, is that we have the ability to opt out. And I'm saying that actually you could redefine the importance and the nature of the state to understand that data of citizens is a public infrastructure that must be used by the citizens. That negates the principle of opt-out entirely. It destroys it. So, and again, if you have an argument, you have two principled people making very wise and well-meaning arguments on both sides. There's no obvious way to resolve the two. I haven't seen it yet.
More thoughts?
Hi, thank you. I have a question, and there's also a statement for Ken. So I'm Ed Jazierski, CEO of Instead, and a lot of what we do is help with technology and data, help social enterprises and NGOs and governments achieve their social mission. And I think we have to put our enterprise and kind of business hat on and look at the supply and the demand. One of the things that we've been trying to do, because I'm sure that there's lots of people here with good social missions that could use data favorably for their programs, but don't have it and it seems hard to get it, is to look at the supplies. So for example, working with diagnostics manufacturers to enable common APIs where every single diagnosis of malaria, tuberculosis, et cetera, can be seen in real time, and enabling the platform so that those with the right rights and opt-in and opt-out things considered can be accessed, that has huge value for data. And for Ken, I'd like to follow up. We do have a conversation going on with GSMA and the Gates Foundation and Harvard School of Public Health and UCSD, I'm trying not to miss anybody, about creating a platform where operators find a business case to operationalize the use of some of the CDR analysis. And basically look at the supply side, because from vaccine planning and census information all the way to migrations because of climate change, there's a huge potential in this data. But Vint Cerf, when he invented the internet like many years ago, made a sort of decision that if you ask him today, what would you have done differently? He tells you we want to make sure that architecture should have been incorruptible from a security perspective. And it wasn't the time to do it back then. But we're trying to do this in that way so that all these principles of opt-in and opt-out are taken into account in the foundation. When the Rwanda genocide happened, the first thing the government did was round up lists of people. And now Rwanda has a national centralized health exchange with a master patient index and medical records for everybody. So I guess the question to the panel is, how do you deal with educating the supply and the demand side of these things? Because we're talking about a lot of the people who are on the demand side discuss these issues, but how do we educate the supply?
You're all nodding very sagely over here.
Yeah, no, that's a tough one.
It might be interesting. I mean, we could sort of come up with answers, but or responses. They're not answers. But maybe we should get a whole bunch of comments from the floor, and then we respond to it as a package. Yeah.
Okay, more thoughts?
Thank you. My name is Isaac Holman. I'm with Medic Mobile. And my question is about the centralization of power. We've been talking a lot of, it's digital equity and individual rights. We've been talking mostly, it seems, about rights, and in particular the right to privacy. But many of us in this room also believe that there, as a matter of equity, there are important factors in society apart from individual rights, like do people have a say in things? And so I'm wondering if big data is as big and powerful as it's said to be or will be, is this new power going to be centralized, or will it be decentralized in the way it's exercised, not just in who it benefits, but in the way it's exercised? And if you have any thoughts about what might be done in that regard in terms of governance. And I don't mean just what governments or the state may do, but in terms of governance of organizations that may come to wield this power. Thank you.
Let's collect one or two other thoughts here.
Hi, I'm not sure if I have much of a voice. My name's Deanna Cohen. I'm a co-founder of Plastic Pollution Coalition. My question, and I was thinking of this earlier, Miguel, when you were speaking in the beginning, but my question would be, would it be possible to create some kind of, almost like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for data? That's my question.
Okay, let's take one more then.
Hi, I'm Caroline Fines. I run a small organisation called Giving Evidence, which works with donors and funders, broadly defined, to help them make giving decisions that are based on good evidence. So clearly this is very relevant. The thing I'm struggling with is this. I can understand how big data helps to identify where a problem is. So you're interested in, for example, flu, like how many people have got flu and where are they? What is less obvious to me is how one uses it to understand whether an NGO's program or a philanthropic program, whether the intervention is working. I can see how you use it kind of at the beginning to define where you should be, but it's less obvious to me to think about, to look at whether your thing is being effective. I mean, clearly if you're trying to reduce flu, you can just look at whether the incidence of flu is falling. But many non-profit interventions have a longer time scale than that. So I'm just wondering how it sort of feeds in, once the program is in play, how big data is relevant.
Okay. We just start backwards there. Miguel, do you want to just start at on the final question? I thought it was particularly...
Yes. So, I mean, as you said, obviously you have a proxy indicator of flu and you see that flu goes down. Okay, this is one solution. Then, I mean, there is a big question how you can evaluate your programs. I mean, typically you have two opportunities. One is getting your data from your programs more in real time and doing analytics there. Other is finding proxy indicators. The time scale, this is the critical question, and this is a critical question in general for big data, in particular for development. I mean, what is real time? I mean, if I'm doing policy in education, I don't care about knowing by the day the number of kids that go to school. Maybe my scale goes in months. If I'm doing if I'm in disaster response, I care by minutes. So it really depends on the scale. Then once you have the scale, you need to find which is the data that varies in that scale. Okay? So probably social media that has high frequency, goes by the minute, is not the right thing to evaluate your program in, I don't know what, education. But maybe you have a program with women and you start to see Google searches around things that matter for women. That means, I mean, so basically what I'm trying to say is find the right data that works at the scale of your programs and try to feedback your program as much as possible. Don't, I mean, it's like in software, it's agile programming, is don't wait until the end of your program to evaluate it. Just try to feedback in real time, and real time is your time scale.
Okay, other questions were around governance of big data sets and declarations of human rights. Who wants to wade in here?
I'll take the one about sort of where the power and centralization is. I mean, one of the things that as a techie that we're really excited about, I think, is that this technology actually can move power to the edges, right? So we are, in many cases, rather than centralizing the data, even though a lot of data is being captured, we can actually change this. So instead of governments telling you whether or not human rights violations are going on, or governments telling you that they have 98% literacy, you have NGOs and people go out there and collecting data that says, ooh, it's not the way they say it is. Or, I mean, one example for us is we reinvented the Library for the Blind by putting blind people in charge of deciding what books would go in there. So now we have the largest library for the blind. Why? Because the community built it for each other rather than us deciding what books blind people should read. So much of the social sector is around pushing on information. everyone is, you almost have to try not to collect data nowadays. I've talked to, I don't know, 20 groups here that want to build an app to collect data. So this is a pretty exciting time, and I think equipping more and more of the communities that we care about with the ability to sort of manage and collect their own data and make their own decisions is, I think, really the exciting side of this two-edged sword.
Can I comment? Can I take Jim's comment and try to also go a little bit to the question of the central and peripheral power? I mean, put yourself back in history to the very beginnings of the internet and the very beginnings of the computer revolution. Vint Cerf was on the board of the Well when we started it. And what we watched happen was that all of these systems had this unexpected, wonderful externality that you couldn't see the person who was commenting. So you didn't know if they were a white man, you didn't know if they were gay or straight, you didn't know if they were black or white. And so the value of their words rang true. And you suddenly found a richness and diversity, and the quality of the conversation increased, and you fought against the concentration of power, especially in the corporation, where all of these, where power became more peripheral. Steve Jobs honestly took the slogan of the 60s, power to the people, and he repeated over and over again in the early commercials and all of his conversations, I am taking away the power from the priests of the mainframes and putting it on everybody's desktop, power to the people. I mean, that was the motive force. So one of the things that's at risk right now with this conversation of the conflation of data privacy and big data and cyber spying and all this stuff is the internet. It's all that freedom that we thought we had. It's this feeling that we're all in it together and that everybody's words were as valuable as everybody else's. Hermetically sealed walled gardens in China, in Brazil, in Iran, in Russia, and now Angela Merkel is saying, I don't want my email to ever go across the Atlantic, all for very good reasons. Some of them for very good reasons, some of them for very bad reasons. The balkanization of the internet, of course, if that happens, all the stuff that we're talking about disappears. Some of the risk of aggregate data disappears, the value of we're all in it together disappears, the aspirational quality, and I think a lot of the economic power, the driver of economic change that the internet has brought us. So it's just one more thing to think about when we open this Pandora's box of big data and we look at all the downsides of it, is to realize that the existence, the governance, 3 weeks ago, the Department of Commerce gave up the licensing arrangement with ICON. I think that most people would say that the Department of Commerce was a benevolent dictator, but on the other hand, people would say the United States reaped 80% of the economic benefit of the internet. How could that be? So these are just things to think about as you begin to deal with the levels of complexity that come out of this topic.
One thing I thought might be interesting to ask you guys is for organizations thinking of using data and big data effectively, and when they're hiring people in order to do this, what kind of skill sets are they looking for? Is it, technical guys? Is it storytellers? Is it people who can interrogate the data? People who can negotiate with big corporations to get hold of the data? What do you think are the real skill sets that people need in the hiring game? Or apart from hiring all of you guys, of course, as consultants.
I mean, for me, it's something in the middle. It's really, for instance, at the UN Global Plus, we are now hiring data scientists that work in development and humanitarian space, which are profile complicated, but but basically it's people with some technical skills, but also with some let's say business skills. And also we have found that, for instance, very good people came from fields like astronomy or bioinformatics, or what's now is called social physics. So basically it's a background of something technical, but then applied to real life problems, which is the next step.
Thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, I think it's going to echo Miguel, it's going to take people from a diverse background. You need to know a bit about math and computer coding, a little bit about statistics, and preferably data visualization and storytelling. Those are the people who are the most effective, say, in data science. However, for a small social organization that wants to be effective and do interesting things with data, it's going to be pretty much impossible to hire someone like that just because these people are being seduced by Google and going off, or Goldman Sachs. So what would be useful is to reach out through your network to get to the universities or to the people who are at Google and Goldman Sachs and say, hey, join our advisory board. If you don't have one, create one. And say, could you just put in just a couple hours a month on some of the problems that we're having so we can just get some really tangible findings from this data. We want to issue a report on our effectiveness that we can give to our donors. We want to have an internal report so we can see that what we're doing and our progress that we're making. That would be, it's very easy for these people who have the skills to make that contribution. They'd like to do it, but no one's knocked on their door. And if you're the first one to knock on the door, you get the benefit of that very skilled person.
Cool. More thoughts from the floor here. Wait for the mic, please.
I'm Heidi Larson. I lead an initiative called the Vaccine Confidence Project here at the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine. And we were set up basically prompted by the northern Nigeria boycott of polio vaccine a decade ago to see if we could pick up to prevent that kind of statewide boycott that reinfected 20 countries, to try to pick up early signals of changing sentiment. This was already 5 years ago when we didn't have as much social media around. But we've been tracking a lot of sentiment around vaccine around the world. And actually, I was with the UN for a very long time, and I feel like with all the human rights work we didn't anticipate what the implications of power to the people. Because frankly, I think the people have the people. I think we should be talking about power to which people, because people in terms of the public and sub-publics have harnessed this medium, but they're actually, right now we're dealing with a few cases where people through social media networks has basically pushed and panicked governments to change policies against evidence. Right now, we're working with some policy briefs with Japan. They've suspended the HPV vaccine because there's been panic in the public. They've used YouTube, social media, a parent whose daughter was presumably affected. Similar thing in India. Clinical trials as well as demonstration projects for HPV were suspended because the government panicked, totally mobilized by the kind of what I call the Arab Spring of vaccination. Similar thing in France, woman complaining and suing the government for multiple sclerosis after HPV. France, thankfully, this time, unlike the hepatitis B, they didn't drop their policy. But how do we somehow get some intelligence in deciphering the important pieces of public sentiment and not panic? And people, we still need some common sense here to hold the ground and say, we hear you, we'll listen to that part, but actually we've got evidence that that's not the right way to go. We need to get that balance of sentiment, intelligence, disease evidence, whatever, somehow anticipate that next wave of, I guess what Tom would talk about is the later stage of the ball game.
It's those skills on how to interrogate and make sense of data, particularly when it comes from big public opinions. What are thoughts of you guys around that?
I mean, I have to say that at Global Plus, we are working in this kind of trying to understand sentiment on populations related to vaccines, which is, as you said, now it's something like it's very important. One thing that we try to do is to validate what we perceive in the social media sphere with the real life, because at the end, all this big data story is, how you can translate digital world into the real life, and from there you can start to act.
Being a techie, one of the problems is that we work with these things called human beings, and they're irrational in many cases. One of the scariest studies I read recently was if you take someone who's politically inclined to not believe in climate change, and then you give them a lot of data on why climate change is actually happening, they become reconfirmed, even more extreme in their belief that climate change isn't happening. So to a little bit, it's how. Yeah. But it's a very similar sort of thing. Is that the facts actually don't necessarily move the political debate, which is the Ian Bloom example, right? We're quite willing to leave gigantic benefits on the table because of people being very sophisticated in how they actually can manipulate public opinion. And so I think our job is being, well, say, those of us who think of ourselves as progressives, is to try to figure out what better tools we can use to counter the fact that the forces of non-progressivism, whatever you want to call them, are actually quite good at stopping the things that might be in the general interest of the general public, but not in the interest of their political party, their corporate interests, whatever it might be.
Jim's point is interesting, and I think where it goes, where it leads, is that there's a limit to the value of data and that big data brings. I expect that we're going to see a huge change in the United States in terms of the adoption of the reuse of vaccines, all because of yesterday's USA Today, in which you saw photographs of children who have been medically mauled to save their lives because they've had terrible, heinous diseases that could have been prevented by having taken their vaccines. And there are such tragic photographs in the USA Today, people snicker about it, but it's such an important part of the media landscape in America that no amount of data would compel a person who didn't want to have their child vaccinated to do it, but you can't not see that photograph and say, oh my God. And so it suggests that while we need to use big data and embrace it for all of the great powers that it brings, and also we should just say data, because although Google will be using big data for most of us, it's just simply classical data processing that in the past took the NSA or Google to do, but today it's been so democratized and is accessible that we can do it too. We should do all of that, but at the same time we need to change people's attitudes in lots of domains through classic storytelling and emotion.
And can we not sometimes use the data and the storytelling skills together rather than seeing them as two separate things?
The USA Today story certainly had lots of numbers in it, but I can be honest and say I have no idea, because I was so shocked by the images that it was irrelevant, right? It didn't matter. That is probably very statistical driven, right?
Interesting stuff. More thoughts over here. We've got quite a lot of thoughts, so let's take a number.
Hi, my name is Carolina, and I work in the Amazon Basin, which means 9 countries. I work with funders working to help people who are suffering with the vulnerability of the region. And we're talking about 35 million people in 9 countries where the state is not present, right? And they are very isolated because of geographical distances. And these people are very keen to work with data because they believe it could help. It could be a path for democracy. It could be a path for health issues. But they are kind of excluded of this process. Although they are digital, they have internet. You might have 1 computer per community, but they have it. So I was wondering, and I'm quite a visitor in this matter, if you have any tips of how these people can today have access to how to deal with big data and how to organize themselves as communities, not as NGOs, not as institutions, to use this in their favor. Thank you.
Great. Let's just take a couple more. I think there's some over there on the back row.
Hi, Amy. Amy Lures from the Skoll Global Threats Fund. I wondered if you, people on the panel, especially Miguel, I guess, would comment on a lot of the focus of big data that's been discussing here is very much on this aspect of it of the hyper-local, hyper-now. But a lot of the issues that we deal with, I work on climate and water change, climate change and water. They're actually related, that's it. Is really needs to look at the long now, needs to be thinking about things in the long term. And so one dilemma that I focus on is thinking about how do we leverage the benefits of this ability to understand and track the hyper-local and hyper-now in the context of this need to promote this long-term thinking and long-term projections.
Another one over here.
I work in India. We work in education, and we do household survey every year, about 330,000 households to see enrollment of children and their learning levels. And one thing we found, and I think related to the topic, is that you can democratize data very quickly. The problem is interpretation. And when people get this data, and then they can be led or misled, as you wish. So the awareness of data is true, it has to be done. But what do you do about understanding interpretation? Because as we heard, the same data can be used to spread panic, and the same data can be used to talk about what's likely and give hope.
But can you just so I can understand your question a bit better, when you say what can we do,
what can be, I'm pointing out that there's a problem. I think there's a problem that you can democratize data, but just because people have data doesn't mean they understand what the interpretation of that should be or could be, or that the interpretation has to be separated from the facts. Often people confuse data and interpretation together, because the same data could mean something else a few years later, because you have to collect more consistent facts. And this is something that is not a part of people's awareness. And I see that media doing that as well. When we reported that for the last 5 years, the learning levels in India among school children in basic reading, writing, arithmetic have been dropping, the media went to town saying the schools are not doing well and so on. The schools were functioning, according to us, about the same level as before. But something else was going on, but nobody was looking at why that might be. And so it becomes just a...
Thank you very much. Let's go for Carolina's question first about the Amazon and about how communities can themselves feel and the ways that they can get access to some of this data which will enable them to help themselves. Thoughts here?
Well, I point out two things. The first is that there's a movement called the open data movement. And so that there is a lot of data sets that if you just look around for it, you'd probably be able to find. You know, in Latin America, you're probably not going to be able to find, that data might not exist, but you could just imagine that the US Geological Survey would have that data, or that a professor at the Colorado School of Mines, which is a great school for geological information, would have that. So if you tap it and you kind of look, you'll find it. The second is the idea of just measurement and counting. The best way to do it is to collect the information and take it on as a project to do that, to quantify as much as you can. By doing that, over time, you'll quantify change. And if things are deteriorating, you would be able to see it. And it would be a much more engaging conversation with donors or with government officials to be able to say, hey, here's the problem and it's getting worse. And we know how much it's getting worse.
Can I combine what Ken just said with the earlier question about what kind of person to hire? Because there's plenty of data out there. There's lots of people every day who are trying to out more and more public data. Hans Rosling has made it his life's work to try to get into every library and every public database and make it available for everybody. But you may not have somebody on your staff, on your team, that you know who could have access to it. They may not be an engineer. They may not be a data scientist. So who should you be hiring? Forget their credentials for a moment. You find people who are relentlessly curious, who have an inquiring mind, whose day-to-day life, they're always the first one to find something in the paper or online that's of interest to you. Find and staff your organization with people like that. Don't be worried if they went to MIT and got an engineering degree, because these are consumers of data, not producers of data. And I think people get a little confused about that. There's lots of data that would help every organization that's represented here that you're not having access to because you don't have the right mix of people and access.
And there's a couple examples, and you may know about this one. I think Amazon Conservation Team has communities map their map with what's important to their community, which is not roads and houses. It could be sacred sites and certain kinds of forests. So basically taking this mapping technology and putting it in a completely different context, but then starting to use that in political advocacy, saying, this is our map of our community, not your map that says where the minerals are, right? So let's actually respect what we see as valuable. I think the other one is, I think Martin Burt of Foundation Paraguay was showing me the poverty stoplight, where instead of his microcredit officers deciding how poor someone is, he hands a tablet to them and they answer 50 questions that have basically 3 pictures, either very poor, or not poor. And it's pushing the power away from our definition to what actually the individuals in the communities actually think is important to them, and giving them the tools to then go after it, as opposed to forcing what we think is good for them on them.
Again, I want to pick up on Amy's question over there, asking about how to leverage the benefits of the now for long-term climate change and water challenges.
Indeed, it's so from a point of view, the now it's the possibility for the first time to think about system levels, okay? To think about different scales. In biology, we have cells, tissues, organs. I mean, we have been studying biology for a systems biology perspective with humans, with human behavior, with what we are doing to Earth. We haven't been working in such a multi-scale approach. So I think that it opens the door to start thinking from the now to the long-term run. And for instance, I think that concept, and I mean, we'll see, we'll have to embed it in the post-2015 development goals, for instance, the fact that we can have different scales, different indicators at different scales, and how we can make the bridge between the scales. I mean, I think that is critical, and from first time now, we can think like that.
And do you think there's a sort of paradigm shift at the different type of thinking that we need when we're talking about the now to the longer term type of thinking? Or is it just a question of gradations on a long line?
I mean, no, it's the question of everyone thinking that we have different scales. I mean, this is a paradigm shift. I mean, this has been in biology, but we have to make that also in, let's say, social science or quantitative social science.
So you think there's a difference in kind at different scales?
I mean, each scale has their things, how they relate. I mean, I mean, it's a different way of thinking because, I mean, as we know, one impact here in one small scale may have a big impact in the full picture. How these things are related, this is the question. I mean, it's an open space. It's like, hey, but it's there.
It's a big challenge. So just coming to the end here, any just few closing thoughts that any of you guys want to bring to this enormous, we've covered such a vast gauntlet of thoughts here. Closing thoughts that you want to leave the audience here with in this whole area, that they think the warnings that you feel they should really bear in mind when they're trying to navigate this space in their own organizations?
Well, I would say there is one thing that's going to make you all very reassured, and that is you're probably going to leave thinking, oh my God, this is vast and immense and we're not prepared for it. Peter Drucker's view of knowledge was really about learning by doing. He had a true view that no one can actually do anything at the outset, but the only way to acquire the skills to do it is to start doing it and then learn through doing. So that's the same thing, exact same thing here. Just get involved at whatever scale is appropriate for your organization, and you will rise up the learning curve and you will find the place where you're going to be able to get benefits from.
You're just happy with that, Larry?
I am. I think if there's one thing that came up, which is a good reminder to all of us when we're talking about something like vaccine hesitancy or climate change, they both have in common that they represent market failures or negative externalities. It's like the old prisoner's dilemma. All this data belongs to all of us, and collectively it does enormous good. If some people have access to it privately and they use it for personal use, it has ripples that are negative for all of us. And we haven't yet caught up with our social science way of looking at it, the way the quantitative sciences have run about. And there'll be a little process of catch up, and hopefully then reason will prevail.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you all for all your brilliant thoughts and comments and questions. Thank you.